Welcome to Faith Informing. I'm Travis, and if you've been with this show for any length of time, you know what we do here. We try to follow the ideas all the way down. We talk to authors, theologians, pastors, people who are thinking hard about what it means to be a Christian in the real world. And then we try to let those conversations actually change how we live. Today, we're starting something I've wanted to do for a long time. We're launching a series, a dedicated multi-episode deep dive on what's called the faith and work movement. Over the coming episodes, we're going to go wide and go deep. We'll trace the history of this movement, where it came from, who built it, and why it had to be built at all. We'll lay a biblical and theological foundation for why any of this matters. We'll look at how different Christian traditions, Reformed, Catholic, Wesleyan, Pentecostal, have contributed to the conversation. We'll ask the hard questions. What are the movement's blind spots? Who has it left behind? And we'll spend time on the specific challenges of faith and work in a technology-saturated world. Because I live and pastor in Palo Alto, which means I'm steeped in Silicon Valley every single day. And these questions are not abstract to me. But today, we start at the beginning. Episode 1 is an orientation. By the end of this conversation, and even though it's just me talking, I genuinely think of this as a conversation, you should be able to answer 3 questions. What is the faith and work movement? Why does it exist? And why should you care? Let's get into it. I want to start with a memory. I was in college working a janitorial job, the kind of job that doesn't show up on a resume. The kind of work you do with a mop at 2 p.m. in a building where nobody knows your name. And I remember standing there. I think it was a bathroom, which tells you something about the glamour of the situation. Talking with a coworker. And I said something out loud that I hadn't quite thought through yet. I said, if all things are for the glory of God, then even cleaning this bathroom is ministry. I don't know exactly where that came from. Some half-digested theology, some verse I had absorbed somewhere. But the moment I said it, something clicked for me. There was a way of seeing that work, anonymous, unglamorous, Tuesday afternoon work, that made it matter. Not because it was going to change the world, not because anyone would notice, but because it was being offered to someone. Then the summer after my freshman year, I worked as a camp counselor. And I remember our leadership team saying something to all of us at orientation that stuck with me. They said, work with gusto this summer. This is God's work for you right now. Not someday, not in spite of the fact that you're making crafts with 12-year-olds and breaking up cabin arguments at midnight. Because of it. Because this is the particular corner of the vineyard you've been given to tend. 2 jobs, 2 formative moments, both of them telling me the same thing. There is no secular corner of life that God doesn't care about. That's the animating conviction at the heart of the faith and work movement. And it sounds almost obvious when I say it out loud. Of course God cares about what we do on Tuesday. Of course our faith is supposed to follow us out the door on Monday morning. But here's the thing. For a lot of Christians, for most of church history, and in most of our churches today, the conviction is not obvious. It's not what we were formed to believe. And the gap between what we profess on Sunday and how we actually think about our Monday through Friday lives is one of the most significant pastoral challenges of our time. The faith and work movement exists because that gap is real and it's costly. Let's put some texture on that. Think about a typical week in the life of someone in your congregation. They spend somewhere between 30 and 60 hours at work. At a job, in a workplace, navigating relationships and decisions and pressures that their faith is supposed to be relevant to. Then they come to church on Sunday. And the vast majority of what happens in the worship service, the preaching, the teaching, the prayer, the formation, has almost nothing to say to what they spent their week doing. This is what people in the faith and work movement call the Sunday-Monday gap. The disconnect between what happens in church and what happens in the rest of life, between worship on Sunday and work on Monday. And it's not just that the church has been silent about work, it's that the silence has communicated something. When the only things that church talks about are personal morality, evangelism, and showing up to serve on a committee, the implicit message to the person sitting in the pew is the rest of your life, your actual daily life, the hours you spend building things, solving problems, serving people, making decisions, that's not really the concern of the gospel. Tim Keller, and we'll come back to Keller a lot in this series, put it this way. He said that most Christians unconsciously adopt one of two postures toward their work. Either they demonize it, they see work as just a way to make money to fund the real spiritual stuff, or they idolize it. They make their work the thing that gives their life meaning and identity. And neither of those is right. The gospel offers a third way, but most of us have never been taught what that third way looks like. The Oxford scholar Dorothy Sayers wrote about this in 1942. And the year matters because she was writing in the middle of a world war, when questions about work and human dignity were viscerally real. She said, "In nothing has the church so lost her hold on reality as in her failure to understand and respect the secular vocation. She has allowed work and religion to become separate departments and is astonished to find that as a result, the secular work of the world is turned to purely selfish and destructive ends." That was 1942. And I would argue that Sayers' diagnosis is still accurate today. Maybe more accurate. The secular work of the world is still being turned to selfish and destructive ends. And one of the reasons is that the people of God haven't been equipped to carry their faith into it. The faith and work movement is, at its core, an attempt to close the gap. To say, no, your work matters to God. It's not a spiritually neutral zone. The gospel has something to say about all of it, about your industry, your decisions, your colleagues, your ambition, your rest, the way you treat the person below you in the org chart, and the way you speak to a client. So what exactly is this thing we're calling the faith and work movement? The quick answer is that it's a loose, global network of scholars, clergy, lay people, and organizations working to reconnect Christian faith to daily work and vocation. The movement goes by a lot of names: faith at work, marketplace ministry, workplace ministry, theology of work. At its center is a conviction that the sacred secular divide, the idea that some parts of life belong to God and some don't, is theologically wrong and practically harmful. The movement doesn't have a headquarters. There's no single organization that runs it. It spans evangelical, Catholic, mainline Protestants, and Reformed traditions. It includes megachurch pastors and Ivy League theologians and small business owners and artists and engineers. It produces books and curricula and conferences and campus programs. The Bay Area Center for Faith, Work, and Tech, where I serve as Director of Church Engagement, is part of it. So is Redeemer, City to City in New York, the Institute for Faith and Work in Economics in Virginia, the Theology of Work Project, and hundreds of other organizations. One scholar, David Miller at Princeton University, has described the faith and work movement as a bona fide social movement. Not just a theological conversation, but an organized, sustained effort to change how Christians think about work and how churches equip their people to live it out. Miller has studied over 450 faith and work organizations, and he wrote what is probably the definitive history of the movement in his 2007 book, God at Work. And we'll draw on his framework quite a bit in this series. There's also a Hebrew word that keeps coming up in faith and work circles. And I want to introduce it to you now because it captures something that the English language just can't do. The word is avodah. Avodah. In the Old Testament, this single Hebrew word carries three meanings simultaneously: worship and service. Those aren't three different words, they are one word. The same word that Moses uses in Exodus when he says, 6 days you shall work. That's avodah. the same word that God uses when he says, "Let my people go so that they may worship me." That's avodah too. The ancient Hebrew had no category for a life divided between sacred and secular, between worship and work. They were the same thing. The faith and work movement is, in part, an attempt to recover that integrated vision. Now, I want to give you a brief sketch of how this movement developed. We're going to spend a full episode on the history in episode 2. So this is not the deep dive, this is the flyover. The scholar I just mentioned, David Miller, divides the history of the faith and work movement into 3 waves, and I find that framework really useful. Wave 1. The first wave runs through roughly from the 1890s through the 2 world wars. It was characterized by 2 parallel developments, one Catholic, one Protestant. On the Catholic side, Pope Leo XIII issued a papal encyclical in 1891 called Rerum Novarum, which I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of, but it means of new things. It was a landmark document addressing the rights of workers in the context of industrialization. It laid the foundation for what would become Catholic social teaching, a tradition that takes the dignity of labor and the rights of workers seriously as theological commitments, not just political ones. On the Protestant side, what emerged was the social gospel movement, associated with figures like Walter Rauschenbusch, who argued that the church had a responsibility to address the social conditions created by industrial capitalism. The question wasn't just, are you saved, but what does the kingdom of God have to say about the conditions in which people work and live? Both of these movements were responding to the same crisis. The Industrial Revolution had transformed how and where people worked, and the church needed to grapple with that. Neither movement survived the 2 world wars with its momentum intact, but both left a theological legacy that later movements would draw from. The second wave runs roughly from the end of World War II into the mid-1980s. And the key phrase here is ministry of the laity. The idea, which now seems almost obvious, but was genuinely countercultural at the time, was that lay people in the church aren't just the audience for ministry, they are ministers. Their work in the world is not a consolation prize for people who didn't become pastors. It's the primary arena of Christian witness and service. Key figures in this wave include Elton Trueblood, an American Quaker philosopher who called for what he described as whole life Christians, people whose faith shaped not just their private devotion, but their public engagement. There's Hendrik Kramer, a Dutch missiologist who wrote a landmark book in 1958 called A Theology of the Laity. There's Sam Shoemaker, who was known for taking the church to the world. And there's Dorothy Sayers, whose 1942 essay, Why Work? I already quoted. She belongs in this wave too. This wave also saw the early developments of small group and workplace Bible studies and prayer groups, informal networks of Christians trying to figure out what it meant to be a Christian in their specific vocational context, often without much help from the institutional church. Eventually, this wave petered out. And interestingly, one of the reasons it petered out is that the church reabsorbed its energy. Instead of sending lay people out to be ministers in the world, the church started redirecting their gifts back into the church programs and committees, which is, and this is a gentle critique, not quite the same thing. The third wave begins in the mid-1980s and is still going. This is the wave we're living in. And according to Miller, it has been exponential, an explosion of organizations, resources, curricula, conferences, seminary programs, and books addressing the integration of faith and work. What catalyzed this third wave? A few things came together. One is demographic. Beginning in the 1970s and early 80s, more evangelicals were attaining college degrees and entering what economists called the knowledge economy. Professional services, technology, finance, media, these were people with good jobs and genuine influence, and they were asking a real question. Does my faith have anything to say about what I do for 40 hours a week? And the church largely did not have an answer ready for them. Another catalyst was the work of key thinkers and institutions. Os Guinness's 1998 book, The Call, became a touchstone for a generation of Christian professionals trying to understand vocation. The Lausanne movement began addressing faith and work integration in its international gatherings. And then Tim Keller at Redeemer Presbyterian in Manhattan began doing something almost nobody else was doing, preaching theology of work sermons to a congregation full of lawyers and finance professionals and artists in one of the most secular cities in the world. In 2012, he and Catherine Leary Alsdorf published Every Good Endeavor. If you read one book to accompany this series, that would be the one I recommend. Today, the third wave has spread across denominations and traditions. It has produced a remarkable body of scholarship and resources, and has also attracted a serious set of critics. People who argue that the movement has largely served the interests of educated, affluent, white evangelicals while leaving blue-collar workers and working-class Christians largely behind. That critique is worth taking seriously, and we'll spend a full episode on it. I want to take a minute and just be pastoral with you about why I think this conversation matters so urgently right now. We are in a moment of profound disruption in the world of work. Automation is reshaping whole industries. Artificial intelligence is doing things that 5 years ago we thought required human intelligence. The pandemic fundamentally changed how and where millions of people work. Young people are entering a labor market that looks almost nothing like the one their parents navigated. The questions of meaning and purpose and dignity in work are more pressing than they have ever been. And the church, by and large, is not equipped for this conversation. We are still, in most of our congregations, operating with a basic framework that says work is how you make money, and money is how you fund the church, and the church is where real spiritual life happens. That framework is not just inadequate, it's actively harmful because it leaves Christians without the theological resources they need to navigate the hardest questions of their lives. I think about the people I pastor. I serve a congregation in Palo Alto, which is to say I serve people who work at Apple, at Stanford, biotech, startups, and venture capital firms, and hospitals and schools. And the questions they bring to me are not questions about personal morality or church attendance. They're questions like, is what I'm building good? Am I complicit in something harmful? How do I maintain my integrity in a culture that constantly rewards compromise? What does it mean to be a Christian at a company whose values I'm not sure align with mine? Those are not questions that the church can ignore. And the faith and work movement, for all its limitations, which we will discuss honestly, has given us real resources for engaging. I also think about the person who isn't in Palo Alto, the person driving a delivery route, the person working a counter at a coffee shop, the person in a manufacturing plant. The question for them is not how do I leverage my career for kingdom impact? The question is, does God see me in this work? Does it matter? Am I more than my paycheck? And the answer, which is the bedrock answer of everything we're going to talk about in this series, is yes. You are, and God is here too. Before I close, let me give you a roadmap of where we are going. Episode 2 is going to be a deeper dive into the history, from Luther's theology of vocation in the 16th century through Dorothy Sayers and Os Guinness to the modern movement. We're going to trace how the big idea got lost and how it's been recovered. Episode 3 is a biblical theology of work, Genesis to Revelation. What does the arc of Scripture actually say about why we work, what it's for, and where it's going? After that, we'll spend time on how different Christian traditions have contributed to this conversation. The Reformed tradition with its emphasis on vocation and common grace, the Catholic tradition with its rich body of social teaching, the Wesleyan tradition's emphasis on sanctification in ordinary life, and others. We'll spend an episode on the critiques because the faith and work movement has real problems and we need to name them honestly. And we'll spend time on the specific challenges of faith and work in a technological age because this is the world we are living in and the church needs a theology that can navigate it. My goal for this series is simple. I want you, at the end of it, to feel like you have a theological framework, a way of thinking that you can actually carry into your week. Not a set of slogans or a list of inspirational quotes, a real, substantive, biblically grounded way of understanding your work as something that matters to God. And I want to say one more thing before I close. I'm not presenting this series as someone who has figured it all out. I'm presenting it as someone who is learning. I took on a role with the Bay Area Center for Faith, Work, and Tech in part because I want to go deep on these questions. And this series is part of that going deep. Consider it my education, done out loud, with you along for the ride. So that's it for episode 1. Thank you for being here at the beginning of this series. If something in this episode landed for you, if you found yourself recognizing the Sunday Monday gap in your own life, or if you've been carrying around some version of these questions without a framework to put them in, I'd love it if you shared this with someone. Pass it along to a friend, a coworker, someone in your small group. That's genuinely how this show grows. And these are conversations worth having with other people. Next time, we're going back to the 16th century. I want to take you into Martin Luther's world. And I mean that almost literally. Luther was not just a theologian. He was a former monk who had been formed in a religious tradition that said the highest calling was to leave the world and devote yourself entirely to prayer. And then he read Romans, and the whole thing came apart. When Luther said that a shoemaker making good shoes is serving God just as surely as a monk saying his prayers, that was not a throwaway line. That was a revolution. We're going to trace that revolution from Luther and Calvin through the Industrial Revolution and the emergence of Dorothy Sayers. And I promise you, the story is better than it sounds. That's episode 2. I'll see you there.